The $64 paper-silver ceiling isn't held up by charts. It's held up by deadlines. There's a quiet contract in the physical lease market that doesn't settle in dollars, doesn't roll forever, and doesn't care about spot. It settles in bars, and the clock is getting loud. If you want to understand what could break the $64 paper-silver price ceiling, you have to stop staring at the chart and start staring at the calendar. Because the most dangerous pressure in this market isn't emotional, it isn't retail FOMO, it isn't even industrial demand, though that is real and accelerating. The most dangerous pressure is contractual, timed, dated, and it's sitting on top of one of the most misunderstood mechanisms in the precious metals world, the physical silver lease market. Let's define the problem in plain English. A physical lease is not a futures contract. It's not a paper bet. It's a real-world agreement where one party that has metal lends that metal to another party for a defined period, for a defined rate, with a defined obligation to return metal, not dollars, at the end. And when a major bullion bank leases silver, they're not doing it because they're bored. They lease silver because physical is scarce, because they need inventory, because they need to meet delivery needs, because they want to control flow, or because they want to turn physical into liquidity without showing the market their real desperation. Here's the tension you need to hold in your mind for the rest of this story. If you borrowed physical silver, you owe physical silver back, not the cash value of silver, not an equivalent exposure, not shares, bars. And in a market that's living on deficits, rolling shortages, and tightening refinery output, owing bars becomes a ticking bomb. Now let's get specific. There have been persistent reports in the silver community that JPMorgan has a massive leased silver obligation on the order of 4,000 metric tons. That's not a cute number. That's not a rounding error. 4,000 tons is roughly 128 million ounces of silver. Let me say that again because the brain refuses to process it the first time. About 128,000 ounces. That kind of quantity is not a trade. That's a strategic stockpile. That's supply chain control. That's the difference between a market that clears and a market that seizes. And the reason this matters right now, late 2025 moving into early 2026, is because leasing isn't open-ended. Leases mature, leases come due, leases hit a deadline, and if even a portion of that rumored 4,000-ton lease is structured with a return window around February 2026, then February isn't just another month. It becomes a delivery month in the real world, a physical delivery month for the bank itself. Now, why is that lethal for $64 pricing? Because $64 is a paper price level. It's a screen price. It's what a leveraged market can print when it has enough confidence that most people won't demand the underlying metal. But a lease deadline doesn't care about confidence. A lease deadline demands metal. So here's the real conflict we're dealing with. On one side, you have the paper market, whose job is to maintain orderly pricing, dampen volatility, and, let's be honest, protect the credibility of the system. On the other side, you have a physical obligation that, if it can't be met with available bars, forces the borrower to go out into the market and source them at any price necessary. That's where $64 starts to look like a fantasy number, because the market is already sending signals that $64 does not represent the true cost of immediate physical. You see it in the premiums. You see it in the delivery friction. You see it in rising lease rates when metal gets tight, because lease rates are basically the market screaming one sentence: pay me, if you can even find it. And this is where JPMorgan becomes the center of gravity. Most people talk about JPMorgan like they're a single simple character. They're short paper, they're hoarding physical. That story is directionally right, but it's incomplete. The more dangerous story, the one that can actually force a discontinuity event, is this. What if the hoarding isn't pure ownership? What if part of the stockpile is temporary possession? What if a meaningful slice of it is leased metal that must be returned on schedule? Because if that's true, then it reframes everything. It means what looks like control could actually be exposure. It means what looks like strength could actually be a deadline-driven vulnerability. And it means the market might be heading toward a moment where the biggest player can't solve the problem with paper tools anymore. Let's walk through the basic mechanics of how a bullion bank can turn leased metal into a pricing weapon, and why that weapon can backfire. Step 1. Borrow physical silver via a lease. Step 2. Sell that physical silver into the market, or use it to satisfy industrial demand, meet delivery requirements, or relieve pressure at a critical point. Step 3. You now owe that silver back later. If silver is stable and abundant, that's manageable. You can buy it back later at the same price or slightly lower, return it, and pocket the spread while the lease rate was cheap. But this isn't a stable and abundant market. This is a market that's been running structural deficits for years. This is a market where industrial demand isn't nice to have. It's embedded into solar expansion, EV wiring, high-performance electronics, and the hard infrastructure of AI data centers. And even worse, this is a market where supply doesn't respond quickly to price because a majority of silver comes as a byproduct of other mining operations. You can't just flip a switch and produce 128 million extra ounces because a bank needs it before a deadline. So in this environment, leasing becomes a trap. Because if you sold leased metal into a tightening physical market, you may have relieved pressure temporarily, but you also created a future scramble. And when that scramble is timed, when it clusters around a window like February 2026, you don't get a smooth repricing. You get a violent repricing. You get a short squeeze, but in physical form. And physical squeezes don't negotiate. They don't care what the COMEX spot price says. They care about one thing. Can you source bars in size, right now, at scale, without detonating the entire supply chain? Now layer this on top of the current pricing regime. Silver has been trading roughly in the $60 to $65 zone. That's already historic. That already tells you stress is present. But there's a difference between a stressed market and a broken market. A stressed market can still pretend, a broken market can't deliver. And the lease market is one of the few places where deliver is not a metaphor. It's the contract. So February 2026 matters because it could force one of the most powerful entities in the silver ecosystem to do something it hates doing in public: compete for physical. Because the moment a bullion bank is forced to buy physical aggressively into a tightening, the whole paper suppression logic starts to collapse. Here's why. Paper suppression relies on the idea that supply can be simulated. You can dump contracts. You can raise margin requirements. You can slam price at thin liquidity hours. You can create the illusion of abundance by printing more claims. But none of those tactics creates one single extra ounce of deliverable metal. And leasing, ironically, is the bridge between the paper illusion and the physical reality. It's how the system borrows time. But time is exactly what a deadline removes. Now you might be thinking, okay, but JPMorgan is huge. They can just source it quietly. They can do off-market deals. They can call refiners. They can call miners. They can call other banks. Yes. And that's exactly why the lease problem is so dangerous. If they move to source it quietly, you may not see it on the chart at first, but you will see it in the symptoms. You'll see it in lease rates spiking. You'll see it in backwardation showing up more frequently, where near-term physical is priced higher than future delivery because the market is screaming that immediate metal is worth more than promises. You'll see it in registered inventory stress. You'll see it in open interest behaving like a loaded gun sitting on top of a shrinking pile of deliverable bars. And you'll see it in premiums disconnecting from spot, because spot becomes a reference number that no longer clears real-world supply. This is why I'm calling it JPMorgan's 4,000-ton silver problem. Not because it's guaranteed that every ounce is due in February, not because we have a signed lease document on camera, but because the market structure makes this kind of deadline risk plausible. And the scale, 4,000 tons, is so enormous that even the possibility should change how you interpret everything happening from now through early 2026. Because think about what 128 million ounces represents in practical terms. That's not some extra bars. That's the kind of demand that can drain available float, especially if it has to be sourced in a compressed window, especially if industrial users are simultaneously accelerating purchases, especially if China's policy posture remains restrictive, and especially if Western vault inventories are not as free and available as the paper accounting implies. This is where the $64 paper price turns into a psychological cage. If the market keeps printing $64 while physical is being pulled tighter and tighter behind the scenes, the spread between screen silver and real silver grows. And spreads don't grow forever. They snap. So here in part 1, the core problem is simple. A major player may have a massive physical return obligation, measured in thousands of tons, coming due into a market that can barely breathe as it is. And if that obligation collides with the February 2026 window, then the question is no longer, will silver go up? The question becomes, what happens to the pricing system when a bank needs metal more than the system needs the price to look stable? Because those two goals are not compatible, not at $64, not with shortages, not with deficits, not with a deadline. And in part 2, I'm going to connect this lease deadline risk directly to the mechanisms that would transmit stress into the public market, how lease rates can spike into a panic signal, how inventories get reclassified and drained, how paper claims multiply right before the music stops, and why February 2026 could become the month where the paper price loses authority to the physical market in a way you can't unsee. So let's talk about how this kind of lease deadline pressure actually leaks into the market, because it never shows up as a press release saying a major bullion bank is cornered. It shows up as symptoms. And when you know the symptoms, you can see the stress building weeks or even months before the headline event. Symptom number 1, lease rates. Lease rates are the heartbeat monitor for physical stress. When metal is abundant, lease rates are sleepy, fractions of a percent, low single digits. When metal is scarce, lease rates don't gently rise. They spike. Because leasing isn't just a yield product. In a tight market, it becomes an emergency tool. A bank isn't leasing because it wants a return. It's leasing because it needs temporary possession of bars to survive a bottleneck, to meet a delivery request, to plug a hole. Now imagine you're sitting on a potential 4,000-ton return obligation, and February 2026 is inside your repayment window. What do? You start sourcing early, quietly. And early sourcing shows up as tightening available supply for leasing, which pushes lease rates higher, which triggers more stress across the system. That is why lease spikes are not a trader's curiosity. They're a warning flare. A market can pretend the paper price is stable. It cannot pretend leasing is easy when the metal isn't there. Symptom number 2, backwardation. Backwardation is one of those words people throw around like it's just a quirky futures structure. It's not. In precious metals, persistent backwardation is the market telling you something blunt. Immediate metal is worth more than future promises. That's a crisis signal in a market that is supposed to be deep, liquid, and deliverable. And if we move into late January and early February 2026, and you start seeing more frequent backwardation in key silver tenors, especially in London and New York pricing relationships, that's the market revealing the truth. The system is paying a premium for time, because time is the one thing a lease deadline doesn't give you. Symptom number 3, COMEX registered inventory behavior. This is where things get ugly. People love to say COMEX inventory is X million ounces, but most of that doesn't matter. Eligible inventory is not the same as registered. Registered is what can actually be delivered against futures. And when the system is under pressure, you often see 2 games played at once. 1, reclassification. Metal shifts between categories. 2, optics management. Numbers are used to calm the herd. If a major bank needs physical, you may see registered inventory get drained. At the same time, open interest stays elevated because paper is still being used to simulate supply, even as deliverable metal gets pulled away. That's when the paper to physical ratio becomes a loaded spring. You can have all the paper in the world. You can have open interest that looks normal to casual observers. But if the registered pile is shrinking, what you're really watching is the number of claims stacked on top of a smaller and smaller base of deliverable bars. And that's how you get a delivery panic. Not because everyone wants delivery, but because enough people want delivery at the same time the system is already stressed for unrelated reasons, like a lease repayment requirement. That's the part most people miss. The trigger doesn't have to be the entire market waking up. It just has to be a few large players pulling at the same time. Symptom number 4, ETF mechanics and paper substitution. This is where SLV and the broader ETF ecosystem becomes relevant. Not because ETFs are evil on their own, but because they can become a pressure valve for the system. When physical gets tight, the temptation is always the same. Settle in cash, deliver equivalents, roll obligations forward, replace bars with bookkeeping. But lease contracts, especially the ones that matter at institutional scale, are designed to avoid that exact escape hatch. If you owe bars and the lender wants bars, a cash settlement is not a solution. It's a default with lipstick. And in a default scenario, trust collapses first, then liquidity collapses second, and then price reprices violently to reflect reality. That's why the lease deadline is so dangerous. It can force real-world behavior in a market that survives by delaying real-world behavior. Now here's the point where the story becomes almost unavoidable. If February 2026 is a pressure window, the system has 3 options. None of them are comfortable. Option 1, source the metal. This means bidding for physical in size, pulling bars out of every corner, London, Zurich, Shanghai flows, private off-market deals, refinery output agreements, and whatever can be drained without setting off alarms. But the more you source, the more you tighten the market for everyone else. Industrial users, sovereign buyers, mints, and other banks. You're not buying silver, you're buying time, and the market charges whatever it wants for time when it knows you're desperate. Option 2, roll the lease. Extend it, renegotiate it, pay a higher lease rate, promise the metal later. This is where you'd likely see lease rates surge because the lender now understands the borrower's vulnerability. The moment you ask to extend, you reveal your problem. And if the lender believes the market is getting tighter, not looser, why would they accept a simple extension? They'll demand a punitive rate, they'll demand collateral, they'll demand terms that effectively admit physical scarcity. Rolling the lease can keep the system alive, but it raises the cost of keeping it alive. It's survival at a premium, and that premium eventually shows up in the pricing structure. Option 3. Attempt some form of settlement that isn't true return. Cash settlement, substitution, equivalent delivery. This is the nuclear option, because once a major lease structure starts resolving in anything other than metal, the entire purpose of leasing collapses. Every lender learns one lesson instantly. If the borrower can't return metal, the lease is not a lease. It's a risk instrument disguised as yield. And once that happens, future physical lending dries up. Which means future physical relief dries up. Which means the system loses one of its critical shock absorbers right when it needs it most. That is how you turn a manageable shortage into a disorderly one. Now let's talk about why the cartel, yes, the bullion banking complex, the paper pricing mechanism, will fight like hell to prevent the public from focusing on this. Because the moment you anchor the silver story to a date, you destroy their greatest weapon, ambiguity. Markets can live with a vague threat. Someday the system breaks. Fine, people ignore that. But February 2026 is different. February 2026 is close enough for procurement departments to plan for, close enough for industrial users to panic buy, close enough for large investors to stop trusting the paper price as a clearing mechanism, and most importantly, close enough for delivery demands to cluster. That's where the danger becomes exponential. Because a physical squeeze is not additive, it's multiplicative. If industrial demand is already pulling and China's posture is restrictive and registered inventories are tight and lease rates are rising and a major bank has a return obligation, that's not 5 separate problems. That's one problem with 5 accelerants. This is how $64 paper pricing can get blown up without a single law being changed, without a formal default announcement, without a dramatic press conference. It gets blown up by the market simply refusing to clear at that number. The screen can print $64, but the street prints a different number. And when the street number spreads globally, through premiums, through delivery delays, through refinery wait times, through mints rationing product, the credibility of the screen collapses. That's when you get the moment the paper market fears most. Price discovery migrates. From paper venues like COMEX and ETF-linked flows to physical venues where delivery is non-negotiable. Shanghai-style behavior, industrial contracts, direct offtake deals, and private vault market clearing. And once price discovery migrates, it rarely comes back. So here's the practical closing question for you. If a 128 million ounce return requirement becomes urgent into February 2026, do you honestly believe the system will be able to keep pretending silver is worth $64? Or will $64 become a historical footnote, like every other stable paper price right before a physical repricing event? Because remember, the paper price is not the cost of silver, it is the cost of belief. And belief fails instantly when delivery fails. Now I want to give you a simple checklist, because if you're watching this channel, you're not here to be entertained. You're here to see the pressure points before they snap. From now through February 2026, watch these 5 things like your timeline depends on it. 1. Lease rates, especially sudden spikes that cannot be explained by normal volatility. 2. Backwardation and front-month tightness signals. Anything that says metal now is being paid up versus metal later. 3. COMEX registered inventory trends, not just the headline totals. Watch the registered category, watch the rate of drawdowns, and watch whether open interest stays elevated while deliverable supply shrinks. 4. Physical premiums and availability in the real market. U.S. Mint product rationing, dealer spreads, delays, and any sign the retail pipeline is being starved. 5. Margin requirement actions at suspicious times. Friday night hikes, weekend emergency changes, anything designed to flush longs, because those moves are almost always a sign someone is trying to cool a market they're losing control of. And if you see those 5 indicators moving together as we approach February 2026, then you're not watching a silver rally. You're watching a system trying to survive an obligation it may not be able to honor at the published price. That is the heart of JPMorgan's 4,000-ton problem. Not the rumor, the structure, the math, the calendar. Because if the physical silver isn't available in size, then the only thing holding $64 together is paper confidence. And confidence is the first thing that disappears when the vault door stays shut. Prepare accordingly. Don't trust the paper price. Watch the physical premiums and keep your eyes on February 2026, because in this market, the most important chart is the one nobody shows you, the deadline.